All right, this is Sensation and Perception, Section A lecture. Our prioritized standard is going to be 5A, and objectively, we're going to evaluate the process of sensation. Sensation is the process by which stimulation of a sensory receptor produces neural impulses that the brain interprets as sound, a visual image, an odor, a taste, a pain, or other type of sensory image. Now, sensation represents initial steps in processing of incoming information and involves changing stimulation into a form the brain can understand, or in other words, the neural signals. So essentially, sensation kind of works in much the same way that like a cell phone actually converts an electronic signal into sound waves that you can actually hear, but instead it takes the sound waves and transforms them again into something that the brain can understand, as a for instance. Now, the sense organs transform physical stimulation, such as light or light waves, as for instance, into neural impulses that give us sensations like light, dark, color, shades. Now, the sense organs include the eyes, the ears, the nose, the skin, the taste buds, as for instance. Now, sensory receptors are specialized forms of neurons that are stimulated by different kinds of energy rather than through transmitters. Now, under most circumstances, our sensory experiences are highly reliable, with humans being able to process a much wider range and variety of sensory input than probably any other species. Yet, humans do have some sensory limitations, like we lack the vision of hawks, lack the hearing of bats, lack the sense of smell of rodents, lack the sensitivity to magnetic fields that you would see in different types of birds. But all in all, they're usually pretty accurate. Now, in order for the brain to comprehend sensation requires what's something called perception, which is a process that makes sensory patterns meaningful. So perception makes meaning of words rather than just a string of different types of visual patterns that you might see with your eyes. Now, perception creates an interpretation of sensation. Since perception is required to make meaning from sensation, the brain actually senses the world, actually indirectly. Now, perception draws heavily on memory, motivation, emotion, and other types of psychological processes. Now, there are three attributes common to all the senses, which include transduction, sensory adaptation, and thresholds. Now, transduction is the transformation of one form of energy into another, especially the transformation of stimulus information into neural signals by the sense organs. Now, transduction begins with the detection by a sensory neuron of the physical stimulus, such as a sound wave made by a vibrating guitar string, as a for instance. When the appropriate stimulus reaches a sense organ, it activates sensory receptors, which are specialized types of neurons, which respond by converting their excitation into a nerve signal. Neural signals then travel from the receptor cells along a sensory pathway through the thalamus, then directed to a specialized sensory processing area that's in the brain. Now, sensory adaptation, this is the diminishing responsiveness of receptor cells after prolonged and unchanging stimulation. So kind of like how your body can adapt to the feeling of swimming in cool water. At first, you're very shocked when you jump in, but then after a while, you don't really notice the water being very cool. That is sensory adaptation at work. Now, while it is important for sensory receptors to announce changes in the external world, so it's important to know when there's a flash of light, a splash of water, a clap of thunder, a prick of a pin, but without sensory adaptation, incoming sensations might quickly become overwhelming. Now, unless it is quite intense or painful, stimulation that persists without changing in intensity or other type of quality usually shifts into the background of our awareness because of sensory adaptation. And the third thing we're going to notice in all of our senses, in order for a stimulus to be detected or recognized by a person, it must meet a certain threshold, which is the minimum amount of physical energy needed to produce a sensory experience. Now, in a laboratory setting, an absolute threshold would mean that the presence or absence of a stimulus is detected correctly half the time over many trials. So the level of detection varies with the mental alertness and the physical condition of a person, but generally speaking, uh, depending on the sense, there are certain things that are common. Like for sight, usually you can see a candle flame about 30 miles on a clear, dark night. Hearing, you can usually hear the tick of a watch 20 feet in a quiet room. Smell, one drop of perfume diffused throughout a 3-room apartment. Taste, you can usually taste 1 teaspoon of sugar and 2 gallons worth of water. Touch, a bee's wing falling on your cheek from about 1 centimeter above. So those are a couple examples of some absolute thresholds. Now, a difference threshold is the smallest amount by which a stimulus can be changed, and the difference will actually be detected half the time. So, like when your parents ask you to turn down the volume on the TV, this would be the level you would actually need to turn it down before they could actually recognize that it was actually any quieter. Difference threshold sometimes is referred to as a just noticeable difference, J&D. Now, the difference threshold is proportional to the intensity of a threshold. So the difference threshold is actually large when the stimulus intensity is high and is small when the stimulus intensity is low. I think this is called Weber's law. So for instance, if the volume on a TV is very loud to begin with, then you'll actually need to decrease the volume a lot to actually notice any difference. But if the volume of a TV is not very loud to begin with, then you will need to decrease the volume very little for people to notice a difference. Now, certain stimuli not activating an absolute or difference threshold are actually still capable of activating sense organs and influencing behavior, which are known as subliminal stimuli. Now, subliminal stimuli are stimuli that are below the level of conscious awareness. The word subliminal actually means below the threshold. Now, subliminal stimuli are just strong enough to activate the sensory receptors, but not actually strong enough for people to be consciously aware of them. So generally, this is somewhere very near the absolute threshold, but below it slightly. Now, subliminal perception. This is the process by which subliminal stimuli act upon the unconscious mind and thus influence behavior. So something is subliminally happening, and essentially your mind kind of primes for something to happen based on that. Now, the idea of subliminal messages, or subliminal advertising for that matter, has grasped the imagination of the public, wondering if people are being manipulated by powerful psychological forces without their consent. Now, psychologists have studied if subliminal words or messages that are flashed for less than 1/100th of a second can actually prime a person's later behavior. And actually, under certain circumstances, people seem to respond to some subliminal stimuli. So things that are just below the absolute threshold. Now, no controlled research has ever actually shown that subliminal messages delivered to a mass audience can actually influence people's buying habits. So, for instance, famously, someone said that they flashed these words, "hungry, eat popcorn," during a movie, and then they said their popcorn sales skyrocketed. And then later they said, "oh, no, that actually wasn't true. That didn't really happen." But nonetheless, people just took the first part of the story and kind of ran with that. But psychology doesn't necessarily back that up. This practice of subliminal messages and advertising seems highly improbable because different people have thresholds at different levels, which means that even though some time something could be subliminal for some people, it would not actually be subliminal for all people. And people that would actually notice would be very angry about potentially being manipulated by different types of businesses. All right, that was Sensation and Perception, Section A lecture. Our prioritized standard was 5A, and objectively now you can evaluate the process of sensation.